Irvine, California, never slept. Even at 7 in the morning on Monday, October 15th, 2023, the city hummed like a well-oiled machine. The freeways were jammed with streams of commuters heading for the glass towers of the business district, and there were lines for coffee at every corner cafe. This city of nearly 300,000 people was the embodiment of the American dream: prosperous, safe, ambitious. Hank Harrison stood at the window of his office in the city council building, watching the morning bustle. At 52, he still looked like a man ready to conquer the world. The gray in his dark hair gave him a dignified air, and his expensive suit fit him perfectly. 8 years on the city council had taught him to read the city like an open book. Every development site, every budget project, every political trend. "Hank, they're ready," his assistant Carol's voice interrupted his thoughts. Outside the door, journalists, cameras, and microphones awaited him. Today, he was to officially announce his intention to run for mayor of Irvine. The press conference went off without a hitch. Hank spoke about the need for progressive reforms, affordable housing, and environmental protection. He promised to make Irvine an even more inclusive city where every family could thrive. The journalists asked predictable questions, and he gave carefully crafted answers. "Mr. Harrison, what do you say to your opponent's criticism of your ties to development companies?" asked a young reporter from the back rows. Hank didn't even blink. "I have always acted in the best interests of our city's residents. My track record speaks for itself. In 8 years, we've built 3 new schools, 2 parks, and significantly reduced crime." After the press conference, Hank headed home to Turtle Rock, one of the most prestigious neighborhoods in Irvine. Their house cost $1.5 million, but that was normal for a successful politician in Southern California. The white Spanish-style mansion with a red tile roof and perfectly manicured lawn looked like an illustration for an article about achieving the American dream. Gwen met him in the kitchen. At 48, she was still beautiful with the graceful beauty that comes with age and self-confidence. Her job as director of development at Children's Hospital of Orange County required constant interaction with influential people, and she did it masterfully. "How did it go?" she asked, without looking up from her tablet where she was checking her email. "Great. The press is friendly. The team is happy." Hank kissed his wife on the cheek and poured himself some coffee. "How are you?" "Preparing for the charity auction. We need to raise $2 million for a new cardiac surgery unit." Gwen finally looked up. "By the way, we're having dinner with the Davidsons tomorrow. Jim could be a major sponsor for your campaign." Their conversation was interrupted by noise on the stairs. Their children, 17-year-old Jake and 15-year-old Emma, were coming down for breakfast. Jake was a carbon copy of his father in his youth, only with a more modern hairstyle and a cell phone permanently glued to his ear. Emma had inherited her mother's grace and sharp mind. "Is Dad famous now?" Emma joked, pouring herself some orange juice. "Not yet, but I'm working on it," Hank smiled. Family breakfasts were one of the few things that still gave him a sense of normalcy in an increasingly complicated life. At the same time, 20 minutes away from the Harrisons' home, in a small studio apartment in Woodbridge, Daniel Coleman was getting ready for another day at work. At 28, he still felt like he was searching for his place in the world. Moving to Irvine 3 years ago had been an attempt to start a new life, but the high cost of living made every month a struggle to survive. His apartment was tiny, only 500 square feet for $2,000 a month. But it was in a good neighborhood and easy to get to work from. The Meridian Bar, where he had been working as a bartender for 2 years, was a popular spot among the local elite, business people, lawyers, politicians. Danny checked his Canon camera, which he had bought on credit 6 months ago. Photography was his passion, and he hoped, his future profession. In the evenings, when time allowed, he photographed cityscapes, portraits, and events. Several of his works had even been exhibited at a local gallery, but that was far from enough to pay the bills. The drive to the Meridian took 15 minutes in his used Honda Civic. The bar was located in the prestigious Spectrum Center, a huge shopping and entertainment complex in the heart of Irvine. Glass facades, expensive shops, restaurants for every taste. The Meridian specialized in craft cocktails and select wines, attracting a wealthy clientele. "Hey, Danny," greeted his manager Rick, a man in his 40s with a perpetually tired expression on his face. It's going to be a busy night. We have 3 large tables reserved, plus the usual after-work crowd. Danny nodded and began his preparations. He polished the glasses, checked the alcohol supplies, and sliced lemons and limes. Being a bartender required not only the ability to make drinks, but also the ability to interact with people. Over the past 2 years, he had learned to read customers, who had come to celebrate a deal, who was trying to forget their problems, who was looking for company. By 6 o'clock, the bar was filling up. The first to arrive were the usual regulars, a group of lawyers from the office next door, a few real estate agents celebrating another sale, and young professionals after work. Danny worked quickly and efficiently, mixing cocktails and making small talk. "Old-fashioned double," ordered a man in an expensive suit, leaning against the bar. Danny recognized him. He was a city council member who had recently announced his intention to run for mayor. Hank Harrison often stopped by here after important meetings or events. "Tough day?" Danny asked as he prepared the drink. "You could say that," Hank smiled wearily. "Politics is a marathon, not a sprint." Danny handed him the cocktail, and Hank remained seated at the bar, lost in thought. He answered calls from time to time, but spent most of the time silently drinking his whiskey. Danny noticed how tense his shoulders were, how he clenched his jaw when he thought no one was looking. Around 10 o'clock, the flow of customers thinned out. Hank was still sitting at the bar, already on his 3rd cocktail. "Would you like something to eat?" Danny offered. "We have some great tapas." "No, thanks. Dinner's getting cold at home." Hank glanced at his watch. "My wife's probably already in bed." There was something in his voice that made Danny look at him more closely. It wasn't just physical exhaustion. There was something else in his eyes. Loneliness? Disappointment? Danny had learned to distinguish these nuances over years of working with people. "Politics takes a lot out of you," he said cautiously. "It's not just politics," Hank replied, then quickly added, "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have said that. It's just that sometimes you feel like an actor who's forgotten where the role ends and real life begins." Danny nodded understandingly. He himself often felt trapped between who he was and who he was supposed to be. "I understand. Sometimes it's easier to be who people expect you to be than to be yourself." Hank looked at him in surprise, as if he hadn't expected such a profound response from a young bartender. For a moment, there was an understanding between them, 2 people playing roles that didn't quite fit them. "I have to go," Hank said, finishing his cocktail. He left a generous tip and headed for the door, but turned back. "By the way, my name is Hank." "Danny," replied the bartender. After Hank left, Danny thought about the conversation for a long time. There was something about this politician that intrigued him. It wasn't power or status, but rather the vulnerability he tried to hide behind his confident facade. Danny knew that feeling well. At midnight, as he closed the bar, he took a few pictures of the empty room. The neon lights reflected off the polished surfaces, the empty chairs waiting for tomorrow's patrons. Maybe it would make a good series about the city's nightlife. The drive home was short, but Danny drove slowly, enjoying the quiet of the empty streets. Irvine looked different at night, less businesslike, more mysterious. Streetlights created pools of light in the darkness, and the occasional passerby seemed like characters in a noir film. Back at his apartment, Danny uploaded the photos to his computer and looked through the day's shots. Among the frames was one photo that caught his attention, a candid shot of Hank taken during their conversation. The politician was looking away, and his face wore such a look of deep thought that it seemed as if he was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. Danny saved the photo in a separate folder. Something told him that their paths would cross again. For the next 3 weeks, Hank visited the Meridian almost every evening. At first, he convinced himself that it was just a convenient place to meet potential sponsors and allies. The bar was in the city center, the clientele was suitable, and the atmosphere was conducive to informal conversation. But if he was honest with himself, the main reason was Danny. The young bartender had a rare quality. He knew how to listen without judging. When Hank talked about political intrigue or the complexities of the election campaign, Danny didn't try to give advice or flatter him. He just listened, sometimes asking insightful questions that made Hank look at the situation from a new angle. "Have you ever felt like you're living someone else's life?" Hank asked one evening when the bar was almost empty. Danny wiped a glass, thinking about his answer. Every day. Sometimes I feel like the real me only exists here, behind the bar at 2 in the morning when all the masks are off. And where does the real you want to be? Behind the camera, photographing the truth that people are afraid to show. Danny put his glass down and looked at Hank. And your real you? Hank was silent for a long time. This question had haunted him for many years. I don't know. Maybe he got lost somewhere between college and my first election campaign. There was an intimacy in their conversations that Hank didn't even experience at home. With Gwen, they discussed plans, commitments, family matters, but rarely talked about dreams or fears. Their marriage had become an effective partnership, but the passion and depth of understanding had disappeared years ago. The turning point came on Friday, November 10th. Hank arrived at the bar after a particularly difficult day. His main rival in the election race, Roger Kennedy, had released an ad accusing Hank of corruption and ties to developers. The accusations were baseless, but in politics, it's not what's true that matters. It's what voters think. Double whiskey, Hank ordered, sitting down at a table in the back instead of his usual spot at the bar. Danny brought his drink and noticed the tension on Hank's face. Want to talk? Is your shift ending at 2? Danny nodded. Wait for me. Let's go for a drive. At 2 in the morning, Irvine was a different city. The wide avenues were deserted, office buildings were plunged into darkness, and only a few late-night diners and gas stations broke the silence. Hank sat in the passenger seat of Danny's Honda Civic, feeling free from responsibility and expectations for the first time in many years. Where are we going? Danny asked. It doesn't matter. Just get me out of here. They drove down Pacific Coast Highway toward Laguna Beach. The road wound along the ocean, and the moonlight turned the waves into liquid silver. Hank rolled down the window and felt the tension leave his shoulders for the first time in weeks. Tell me about photography, he asked. Danny talked about light and shadow, about moments of truth that can only be captured by a camera, about how an image can tell a story better than 1,000 words. His voice became more animated when he talked about his passion, and Hank couldn't help but notice how handsome he was at that moment, young, sincere, full of hope. They stopped at an empty parking lot by the beach. The ocean roared in the darkness, and the salty wind carried the smell of seaweed and freedom. Why did you become a politician? Danny asked. I wanted to change the world, Hank smiled. Cliché, right? In college, I believed that politics was a way to help people, to make society more just. Now I spend half my time fundraising, and the other half trying not to say the wrong thing. What would you say if you weren't afraid? Hank turned to Danny. In the moonlight, the young man looked almost ethereal. I'd say I'm tired of pretending, that sometimes I just want to disappear and start over. What's stopping you? Family, responsibility, fear of disappointing the people who believe in me. What about your own desires? Hank didn't answer. Instead, he looked at Danny, and something in the air between them changed. The electricity he had been trying to ignore for the past few weeks became impossible to deny. Danny, he began. I know, the young man replied. I feel it too. The first kiss was tentative, almost uncertain. But when Danny responded, all doubts vanished. Years of suppressed desires and hidden needs burst forth. Hank hadn't kissed like that since he was 20, and he had forgotten what it was like to feel such passion. They sat in the car, holding hands and looking out at the ocean until dawn began to break. What now? Danny asked. I don't know, Hank replied honestly, but I can't pretend this didn't happen. Over the next 2 weeks, they met whenever possible. Hank used the election campaign as an excuse for late meetings and late nights. Gwen was too busy with her projects to ask many questions, but Hank noticed her searching glances. Their meetings were furtive and desperate. Sometimes they met in a cheap motel by the freeway, sometimes in empty parking lots late at night. Hank felt like a teenager, sneaking around and creating elaborate alibis. But for the first time in years, he felt alive. Danny showed him another Irvine, the places where politicians don't go. Small Mexican restaurants in East Irvine, art galleries in old warehouse buildings, coffee shops where struggling artists and writers worked. In this world, Hank could just be a person, not a public figure. "Take my picture," he asked one day as they sat in Denny's at 3 a.m. "Why?" "I want to see myself through your eyes." Danny took out his camera and took a few pictures. Later, reviewing the photos on his laptop, Hank didn't recognize himself. The pictures weren't of Hank Harrison the politician, but of a man, relaxed, smiling, vulnerable, real. But reality always intruded. Phone calls from his campaign manager, meetings with donors, speeches at local events. Hank was torn between two worlds, and the stress was beginning to take its toll. Gwen was the first to notice the change. "Are you okay?" she asked one morning at breakfast. "You look tired." "The campaign is taking a lot out of me," Hank replied, without looking up from the newspaper. "Maybe you should take a day off? We could go to Santa Barbara for the weekend." "I can't. Too many meetings." Gwen studied his face. 23 years of marriage had taught her to read his moods, and something was not right. "Hank, if there's a problem—" "No problems," he replied too quickly. "Just stress." But Gwen was no fool. She had noticed the mysterious phone calls he took in another room, the strange absences that weren't explained by the campaign schedule, the changes in his behavior at home. He had become distant, distracted, often lost in his thoughts. In her own work with the Children's Hospital, she interacted with many influential people, including other politicians. She knew what campaign stress looked like, and this was something else. One evening, when Hank said he had a late meeting with potential donors, Gwen decided to check. She drove to the campaign headquarters, but the building was dark and empty. Her heart raced. Where was he? Gwen spent the rest of the evening coming up with explanations. Maybe the meeting was somewhere else. Maybe he forgot to tell her. But deep down, she knew something was wrong. When Hank came home at 1:30, she was waiting in the living room. "How was the meeting?" she asked in a casual tone. "Fine. Productive." He avoided her gaze. "Why aren't you asleep?" "I couldn't sleep." "Hank, can we talk?" "Now? It's late." "That's why we need to talk. When else do we have time?" Hank sat down next to her on the sofa, but kept his distance. "About what?" "About us, about what's going on. You've changed, Hank. And don't tell me it's because of the campaign. I know you too well." Hank sat silently for a few seconds. Part of him wanted to tell her everything, to free himself from the weight of his secrets. But he knew that the truth would destroy everything: his family, his career, the life they had built together. "It's just a lot of pressure," he finally said. "When the election is over, everything will go back to normal." Gwen looked at him for a long moment. "Hank, if there's someone else, how can you say that?" He stood up abruptly. "After all these years? Because you're acting like a man with secrets, and I'm not an idiot." "There's no one else," Hank said, technically telling the truth. Danny wasn't someone else. He was someone completely different, a part of Gwen's life she couldn't even imagine. But his denial sounded too forceful, and Gwen noticed it. After he went to the bedroom, she sat in the living room for a long time, trying to understand what was happening to her marriage. Meanwhile, Danny was also facing a reality check. Their relationship, however intense it was, existed in a vacuum. Hank came to him from one life and returned to another, leaving Danny alone with mixed emotions. He was falling in love, but he knew it was a road to nowhere. Hank would never leave his family and career, and Danny couldn't continue to be a secret, someone hidden from the world. Financial pressures were also mounting. Rent had been raised by $200, which meant even more shifts at the bar and even less time for photography. Danny began to wonder if this forbidden relationship was worth the sacrifices he was making. But when he saw Hank, the vulnerable, authentic version that only existed with him, all doubts disappeared. At least for a while. December in Southern California brought rare rain and unusual coolness. Danny stared at the eviction notice the management company had slipped under his apartment door. 3 months behind on rent. He had 30 days to find $4,800 or leave the apartment. He sat down on the only chair in his tiny studio and put his head in his hands. Extra shifts at the Meridian helped, but they barely covered his living expenses. The loan for his camera, car insurance, groceries, every dollar he earned went toward those things, and now he had rent to pay. His phone vibrated. A message from Hank. "Can we meet tonight? I need to see you." Danny stared at the screen for a long time before replying. Over the past 2 weeks, their meetings had become less frequent. Hank explained it away as the intensification of the election campaign, but Danny felt there was more to it than that. The pressure of real life was mounting on both sides. "I can't. I'm working until 3, he wrote. "I'll wait." That night, Hank did indeed wait until the end of his shift. He sat in his Lexus in the parking lot of a shopping center, and even in the darkness, Danny could see the tension in his posture. In recent weeks, the politician had looked increasingly tired and paranoid. "Problems at home?" Danny asked, getting into the passenger seat. "Gwen is getting more suspicious. Yesterday she asked me who I was meeting on Tuesday. Specific questions she never asked before." They drove to their usual spot, an empty parking lot behind a closed office building. The car was warm, but the atmosphere between them had turned cold. "Hank, maybe we should—" "No," the politician interrupted sharply. "Not now. The election is in 3 months. After that, everything will change." "Change how?" Hank didn't answer. They both knew that nothing would change. If he won the election, the pressure would only increase. And if he lost, the scandal would destroy his life just as effectively. "I'm having trouble paying my rent," Danny said. He hadn't planned on bringing it up, but the words came out before he could stop them. "How much do you need?" "Almost 5,000, but I'm not asking." "I'll give it to you," Hank said, pulling out his checkbook. "Consider it a loan." "Hank, no, I don't want your money." "Why?" Danny couldn't explain. Taking the money would change everything between them. It would turn their relationship into something transactional, something dirty. "I just don't want it." Hank put away his checkbook, but Danny could see the hurt in his eyes. "Then what are you going to do?" "I'll find a way." The next day, Danny received an email from a local art gallery. They wanted to buy 3 of his photographs for an upcoming exhibition, Cityscapes of Irvine at Night. They weren't paying much, but it was something. Looking through the files on his computer, choosing the best shots for the gallery, he stumbled upon a folder with photos from the last few months. Among them were several shots of Hank, the one from the bar that he had taken on the first night, and a few more recent ones. One particular shot made him stop. He had taken it a week ago when they met at that motel by the freeway. Hank was getting out of his car, and Danny automatically raised his camera. The politician was clearly visible in the photo, with the motel sign in the background. The license plate of his Lexus was also in the frame. Danny stared at the photo for a long time. It was a smoking gun, proof of an affair between a married politician and a young man. In the hands of journalists or political opponents, this photo could destroy Hank's career instantly. He wanted to delete the file, but something stopped him. Instead, he copied the photo to a flash drive and hid it in his desk drawer. The next few days were spent in agonizing reflection. The eviction notice lay on the table, a constant reminder of his desperate situation. Danny looked for additional work, but in the service industry, everyone paid barely minimum wage. On Thursday evening, when he was closing the bar particularly late, an acquaintance approached him, Tommy Martinez, who worked at a nearby restaurant. "Heard you're having trouble with your rent," Tommy said, lighting a cigarette at the back door. News travels fast. In this business, everyone knows everything. "Listen, I have a proposal. You know Rich Kellerman, the real estate guy who comes here with clients?" Danny nodded. Kellerman was one of the regulars, a flashy guy in expensive suits who often bragged about his deals. He pays good money for information, about clients, about who they're meeting with, what they're discussing. Nothing illegal, just gossip. Gossip? Rich people love drama, and they pay for exclusive info. Kellerman has connections with tabloids, social media influencers. One good story might solve your problems. Danny felt a sick sensation in his stomach. "I can't think about it," Tommy said, throwing his cigarette on the ground and heading for his car. 5,000 is nothing for the right story. Danny didn't sleep that night. The flash drive with Hank's photo lay in his drawer like a ticking bomb. He He could solve all his financial problems with one phone call, but it would destroy the man he loved or thought he loved. The next day, another notice arrived, this time from his credit card company. He was over his limit, and they demanded immediate payment. His electric bill was also overdue. Danny took out the flash drive and stared at it for a long time. Then he texted Hank, "We need to meet. Urgent." They met that night at a 24-hour diner on the outskirts of town. Hank looked exhausted. The campaign was entering its final stretch, and the pressure was mounting exponentially. "What's wrong?" he asked, ordering coffee. Danny placed the printed photo on the table between them. Hank stared at it for a few seconds, and his face turned white. "Where did you get this?" "I took it myself, a week ago outside the motel." "Danny," Hank's voice was almost a whisper. "What do you want?" "Help. I'm getting evicted. I don't have money for rent, for loans, for living, and you do." "I offered to help. You refused. Then it would have been a gift from a lover. Now it's a business transaction." Hank looked at the photograph, then at Danny. "How much?" "10,000, for the first time." "For the first time?" "I have other photos, and there will be more if we continue to see each other." The silence between them became deafening. Hank realized that everything had changed irrevocably. The man he had considered a refuge from the political world had become another threat. "This is blackmail," he said quietly. "It's survival," Danny replied. "You can afford 10,000. For you, it's pocket change. For me, it's the difference between having a roof over my head and sleeping in my car." Hank closed his eyes. "What if I refuse?" Danny took out his phone and showed him the contact information for several local journalists, including Marcus Thompson from the Orange County Register. Then the story becomes public. A married political candidate in a secret affair with a young man. Think about the headlines. "You'll destroy my family. You destroyed it yourself when you started seeing me." Hank opened his eyes and looked at Danny. There was no anger in them, only infinite sadness and resignation. "I'll get you the money, but after that, we'll see." The next day, Hank transferred $10,000 to Danny's bank account. Officially, it was a campaign contribution from a dummy corporation, one of many financial maneuvers that were legal but ethically questionable. Danny paid his rent and paid off his most urgent debts. But the relief was temporary. He understood that he had crossed a line from which there was no turning back. His relationship with Hank, complicated as it was, had turned into something ugly and dangerous. Hank also understood the new reality. His political future was now in the hands of a man who could destroy everything with one phone call. He tried to rationalize the situation. $10,000 wasn't a huge amount in the context of his campaign budget, and maybe Danny would be satisfied with that. But deep down, he knew this was only the beginning. Gwen, meanwhile, continued her own investigation. The strange financial transactions in their joint account had not gone unnoticed. $10,000 in campaign expenses that did not appear in any official records. She also hired a private investigator, discreetly, through a lawyer friend. The PI was expensive, but Gwen had her own savings from years of working in the nonprofit sector. "I want to know where my husband is spending his time," she told the investigator during their confidential meeting. "And with whom?" "Any specific suspicions?" "An affair, but I don't know with whom." The PI nodded. He had experience with such cases. Prominent men in Orange County often lived double lives, especially politicians under constant public scrutiny. "Give me 2 weeks," he said. Over the next week, Danny received another desperate call from Tommy Martinez. "Kellerman wants to know if you have anything juicy. He's willing to pay big money for the right story." "How big?" "50,000. Maybe more if the story is scandalous enough." Danny felt dizzy. $50,000 would solve all his problems permanently. He could quit his job at the bar, focus on photography, maybe even move into a better apartment. What kind of story does he want? Political scandal, preferably. Something with sex or corruption. Think about it. That night, lying in bed in his tiny studio, Danny stared at the ceiling and thought about $50,000. Hank had already paid him 10, so clearly he was vulnerable. And if Danny could milk the situation further, he took out his phone and texted Hank, "We need to meet tomorrow, there's a development." Hank replied almost immediately, What else do you want? 25,000. And regular payments, say 5,000 a month. You're out of your mind. I'm being realistic. Your campaign is spending millions. This is a drop in the bucket. A long pause, then. See you tomorrow. They met at the same diner, but the atmosphere was completely different. Hank didn't just look tired, he looked haggard. Stress was eating him alive. Monthly payments are impossible, he said without preamble. Then a lump sum. 50,000, and I'll disappear from your life. 50,000? Final payment. After I get the money, I'll delete all the photos and forget we ever met. Hank looked at him for a long moment. What if I don't believe you'll keep your word? Then you have a problem. Silence stretched between them. Finally, Hank said, I need time to arrange that kind of money. A week, maybe 2. You have 1 week. After Danny left, Hank sat in the diner for another hour, staring at his cold coffee. His political career, his family, his future, everything was hanging by a thread. And the young man he once loved was holding the scissors. He realized he was in an impossible position. Even if he paid 50,000, what guarantee did he have that Danny wouldn't come back for more? Blackmailers rarely stopped after the first payment. Over the course of that week, Hank considered various options. He could go to the police, but then the affair would become public. He could try to talk to Danny, but the young man was clearly desperate and determined. There was only one way to ensure that this nightmare ended permanently. Hank had never considered violence before, but now, faced with the destruction of everything he had built, dark thoughts began to creep into his mind. Sunday, January 14th, 2024, began like any other winter day in Irvine. Gray clouds covered the sky, promising rain, which was rare for Southern California. William R. Mason Regional Park was quiet, too early for joggers, too gloomy for family picnics. Daniel Coleman walked along the path near the lake, holding his phone in his hand. Last night, he had received a message from Hank asking to meet. Last time, I'll bring the money, the politician had written. The meeting place was unusual. They usually met in enclosed spaces, but Hank insisted on the park. Danny arrived half an hour early. The nervousness of the last few weeks had turned into constant anxiety. Even with $50,000, he wasn't sure he could just disappear from Hank's life. There was too much between them: love, hate, mutual dependence. At 7 in the morning, the park was practically empty. Only an elderly Chinese man was practicing Tai Chi by the pond, and a woman was walking her dog at the far end of the park. Danny sat down on a bench overlooking the lake and waited. A black Lexus pulled into the parking lot at exactly 7:30. Hank got out of the car slowly, looking around. Even from a distance, Danny could see the tension in his posture. The politician was carrying a small sports bag, probably with the money. "You're here," Hank said as he approached the bench. "Did you think I wouldn't?" Hank sat down next to him but kept his distance. "The money's in the bag, 50,000 in cash." Danny looked inside the bag. The wads of bills were neatly stacked. What guarantees? What guarantees that in a month you won't come back and demand the money back, or send people to make me shut up? Hank turned to him. There was something in his eyes that made Danny feel cold. "You think I'm capable of violence? I don't know. I used to think I knew you." They sat in silence for several minutes, looking out at the lake. Ducks swam among the reeds, creating circles on the dark water. It was an idyllic scene that contrasted with the tension between the two men. "What happens next?" Hank asked. "Next, we part ways. You go back to your family and politics. I'll take the money and disappear." "Where?" "Far away from here. Maybe San Francisco, or the East Coast." Hank nodded. "It's for the best." But when Danny reached for his bag, Hank grabbed his arm. "Wait, what?" "I want you to delete the photos in front of me. All copies, all files." Danny pulled his hand away. "Not here, it's too open." "Then let's go to your apartment." "Why?" "I gave you my word." "Your word is worthless now." Hank's voice was cold. "You turned what we had into a business transaction. Now I want to make sure the deal is done right." Danny looked at him closely. Something in Hank's tone alarmed him, but he couldn't put his finger on it. Fine, let's go to my apartment. They headed for the parking lot, Danny carrying the bag of money. Hank walked beside him, glancing back periodically. The park was still almost empty. The Chinese man had left. Only the woman with the dog remained, but she was far away. "Let's take my car," Hank said. "You can get yours later." "Why?" "It's just easier." What happened next lasted only a few minutes, but those minutes changed everything. There were no witnesses. The surveillance cameras in that part of the park hadn't been working for 6 months. Only the lake and the trees saw the last moments of Daniel Coleman's life. At 8:45 a.m., Martha Suarez was walking her golden retriever Max in Mason Park when the dog began acting strangely. The usually obedient dog suddenly darted toward the bushes by the lake and began barking. "Max, come here!" Martha called. But the dog did not listen. As she got closer, she saw what made her scream. Lying among the bushes was the body of a young man. He was face down, his arms outstretched, with a dark pool of blood on the back of his head. With trembling hands, Martha dialed 911. 911, what's happening? "I found a body in Mason Park by the lake. He's dead, I think he's dead." The first police car arrived 6 minutes later. Officer James Rivera cordoned off the crime scene with yellow tape and called for detectives. The park quickly filled with emergency vehicles, police, paramedics, and forensic technicians. Detective Sarah Mitchell received the call at 9 in the morning while drinking coffee in the kitchen of her apartment in Tustin. 41 years old, 15 years on the force, the last 3 with the Irvine Police Department's Homicide Division. Moving from Cleveland was an attempt to start a new life after her divorce, but crime was the same everywhere. "Murder in Mason Park," Sergeant Garcia told her. "Young male, gunshot wound to the head." "I'm on my way." Sarah finished her coffee and headed for her car. The crime scene was already cordoned off when she arrived. Forensic technicians were photographing the body and the surrounding area, and a medical examiner was conducting a preliminary examination. Sarah put on latex gloves and approached the body. The victim, a man in his late 20s, medium build, wearing jeans and a plaid shirt. Gunshot wound to the back of the head, fired at close range. There was surprisingly little blood. Most of it had been absorbed into the ground. "What do we know?" Sarah asked Officer Rivera. "The body was found by a woman walking her dog at around 8:45 a.m. The victim's ID is Daniel Coleman, 28 years old, address in Woodbridge." Sarah examined the scene more closely. The body was lying in the bushes, a few meters from the path. There were no signs of a struggle. The victim's wallet was still there with the money and credit cards inside, so robbery was ruled out. Time of death? The medical examiner, Dr. Chen, looked up from the body. "Preliminary estimate is between 7 and 8 in the morning. I'll have a more accurate time after the autopsy." Sarah nodded. A shot to the back of the head at close range suggested that the victim knew the killer or was taken by surprise. But there were no signs of a struggle, which meant that Daniel either trusted his killer or did not expect an attack. Any of the victim's belongings found nearby? His phone was in his pocket, his car keys, the forensic technician reported. The victim's car isn't in the parking lot. Interesting. If Daniel drove to the park in his own car, where was it? Sarah ordered a search of all parking lots within a mile radius. The next few hours were spent on routine work. They interviewed Martha Suarez, a witness who hadn't seen anything suspicious before the body was found. They searched for surveillance cameras. There were several at the park entrances, but the quality of the footage left much to be desired. At noon, Daniel's Honda Civic was found in a shopping center parking lot 2 miles from the crime scene. The car was locked, with no signs of forced entry. This meant that either the killer had taken the keys or Daniel had arrived at the park with someone else. The victim's apartment in Woodbridge was searched in the afternoon. It was a small studio, neatly tidied with photographic equipment in the corner. Bank documents were lying on the table, a recent transfer of $10,000, the source of which had yet to be determined. "Detective Mitchell?" Officer Thomas appeared at the door of the apartment. "The neighbors say the victim worked as a bartender at the Meridian Bar. The manager has agreed to talk to you." Sarah nodded. The workplace was always a good source of information about the victim, Friends, enemies, problems. The Meridian Bar was located in the prestigious Spectrum Center. Even during the day, the place looked elegant and expensive. Manager Rick Anderson was clearly upset by the news of his employee's death. "Danny was a good guy," he said, nervously shuffling papers on his desk. "Reliable, punctual, the customers loved him. Did he have any problems with any of the patrons? Any conflicts?" "Not conflicts, exactly, but he seemed tense the last few weeks. Stressed out. I thought it was because of money problems." "What kind of problems?" "Rent, loans. It's hard to live in Irvine on a bartender's salary. But things seem to be looking up lately." Sarah wrote down every word. "Improved how?" "He paid off his debts and stopped taking extra shifts. He said he got some financial help." "From whom?" Rick shrugged. "He didn't say, but I assumed it was from family or a friend." Sarah asked for a list of the bar's regular customers, especially those who had interacted with Daniel. Rick reluctantly provided the information. The names included influential people in the city who would not appreciate the attention of the police. "Is there anyone in particular who often talked to Daniel?" Rick thought for a moment. "There was one regular customer, some politician, a city council member. He often stayed late talking to Danny at the bar." "Name?" "Harrison, I think. Hank Harrison." Sarah looked up from her notebook. Hank Harrison was a candidate for mayor, one of the most prominent political figures in the city. If he was connected to the victim, the case could take a completely different turn. "How often did he come in?" 2 or 3 times a week in recent months. Always alone, always ordered an old-fashioned, always talked to Danny. By evening, Sarah had a general picture of Daniel Coleman's life. A young man with artistic ambitions, working as a bartender to make ends meet. Recent financial problems that had suddenly been resolved. A possible connection to a prominent politician. But there was one element that didn't fit the picture. During a search of the apartment, Daniel's computer was found with an extensive collection of photographs. Among the cityscapes and portraits were pictures that caught Sarah's attention. The photos were taken in different parts of the city, restaurants, motels, parking lots, and many of them featured the same man, a middle-aged man in expensive suits, often getting out of a Lexus or entering buildings. Sarah showed the photos to the officer who had been working in Irvine the longest. "That's Hank Harrison," he confirmed. "City councilman running for mayor." An interesting coincidence. The politician who had often talked to the victim at the bar was also the subject of her photos. Coincidence or intentional? The next morning, news of the murder appeared in all the local media. "Young man killed in Mason Park," read the headline in the Orange County Register. Journalist Marcus Thompson, known for his investigations into political scandals, was already inquiring about the case. Sarah knew that media pressure would only increase, especially if a connection to a prominent politician was revealed. She had to work quickly and carefully. Her first step was to talk to Hank Harrison, not as a suspect yet, but as a possible witness who might have known the victim. Harrison's office in the city council building was impressive. Large windows overlooking the city, expensive furniture, walls hung with photographs of influential people. Harrison himself looked exactly how a politician should look, well-groomed, confident, with a practiced smile. "Detective Mitchell, how can I help you?" He pointed to a chair across from his desk. "We're investigating the murder of a young man named Daniel Coleman. Did you know him?" Sarah watched Harrison's reaction closely. A slight tension in his eyes, a pause before he answered. "Danny? Of course I knew him. He worked at a bar I sometimes go to. Terrible news. When was the last time you saw him?" "Last week, I think, maybe the week before. I don't remember exactly." "Did you talk to him often?" "Sometimes. He was a good bartender, knew how to keep a conversation going." Harrison answered confidently, but Sarah sensed undercurrents. Something about his manner was slightly off. "Where were you yesterday morning between 7 and 9? "At home with my family. We had breakfast and discussed plans for the day. My wife can confirm that." Sarah wrote down the information. The alibi seemed solid, but she planned to check it out. "Mr. Harrison, were you aware of Mr. Coleman's financial problems?" "I knew that life in Irvine was expensive for a young man on a bartender's salary, but I didn't know of any specific problems. And you didn't know that his situation had recently improved? The pause was a little longer this time. No, I didn't. After talking to Harrison, Sarah felt she had gotten answers, but not the truth. The politician was hiding something, but what that was remained to be seen. Detective Sarah Mitchell spent a sleepless night studying the case files. Printed photos from Daniel's computer lay on her desk. Dozens of pictures of Hank Harrison in various locations, motels, restaurants, empty parking lots. These weren't random shots, but targeted surveillance. On Tuesday morning, she received the results of the analysis of the victim's financial transactions. A transfer of $10,000 had come from a corporate account linked to Harrison's election campaign. Officially, it was a consulting fee, but there were no documents confirming the services. "Sergeant Garcia," Sarah called. "I need a warrant for Harrison's financial records, and check the camera footage from the Spectrum Center parking lot for the last 2 weeks." While the paperwork was being processed, Sarah decided to talk to Harrison's wife. Gwen Harrison agreed to meet her at her office at Children's Hospital. The 48-year-old woman looked exhausted. Dark circles under her eyes, a tense posture, hands that couldn't find rest. "Mrs. Harrison, I'm investigating the murder of Daniel Coleman. Your husband said he was home with his family on Sunday morning." "Yes," Gwen replied, but there was uncertainty in her voice. "Could you be more specific? What time did he wake up? What was he doing?" Gwen hesitated. He got up early. He said he couldn't sleep. I woke up around 7, and he was already out of bed." "Where was he?" "In his study, working on campaign documents. Then we had breakfast together." "What time was breakfast?" "Around 9, maybe 9:30. Sarah wrote down every word. Harrison's alibi had a gap, enough time between getting up early and having breakfast to drive to the park and back. "Mrs. Harrison, have you noticed any changes in your husband's behavior lately?" Gwen was silent for a long time, clearly struggling with herself. Finally, she said, "Detective, may I ask you something in confidence?" "Of course. I hired a private investigator. I suspected Hank was having an affair. The detective should be submitting his report this week." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. "What made you do that?" "Strange absences, secret phone calls, unexplained expenses. And then," Gwen took a printout from her purse. "This is a bank statement, $10,000 transferred to an unknown person." Sarah looked at the document. It was the same transfer Daniel had received. "Mrs. Harrison, I need to contact your private investigator. His name is Bill Carter." Private investigator Bill Carter turned out to be a former police officer with 30 years of experience. His office was located in an unremarkable building in Santa Ana, but he worked professionally. "I followed Harrison for 3 weeks," he said, showing photos. "And yes, he was having an affair, but not with a woman." Carter laid out a series of photos on the table. Hank Harrison entering a motel with a young man, getting out of a car near a bar, kissing the same young man in an empty parking lot. "That's Daniel Coleman," Sarah said. "The murder victim? Shit." Carter leaned back in his chair. "I was supposed to give Mrs. Harrison the report tomorrow." "When were the last photos taken?" "Saturday night. They met at the same motel by the freeway." Sarah studied the photos. The motive was becoming clear. A gay affair could ruin Harrison's political career in conservative Orange County. Add blackmail to that. Back at the department, Sarah received a call from the crime scene investigators. "Detective, we found something interesting. There's gunpowder residue on the steering wheel and driver's seat of Harrison's car." "Are you sure?" "Minimal amounts, but definitely present. Someone fired a gun and then got into that car." Puzzle pieces were falling into place. Affair, blackmail, financial motive, physical evidence. But Sarah needed more for an arrest warrant. The answer came from an unexpected source. Marcus Thompson, a journalist with the Orange County Register, called her that afternoon. "Detective Mitchell, I have some information that may interest you. An anonymous source sent me some compromising photos of a politician." "Which politician?" "Hank Harrison, with a young man who, as I understand it, was murdered." Sarah met with Thompson an hour later. The journalist showed her the email he had received the night before. Several photos of Harrison and Daniel in compromising situations, and a short message. "Politician killed his lover to hide the truth. Who sent it?" an anonymous email account. But the timing is interesting. It came a few hours after the news of the murder became public. Someone knew about the relationship and decided to use the murder to expose Harrison. Perhaps the killer himself, feeling guilty, or someone else who knew the secret. By evening, Sarah had enough to make an arrest. The warrant was signed by a judge at 6 p.m. The timeline was tight. Harrison could try to flee if he felt pressure. The arrest took place at the Harrisons' home at 6:30 p.m. Sarah arrived with 2 patrol cars, hoping to avoid the media circus, but it was too late. News trucks were already parked outside the house. Someone had tipped off the press. Hank Harrison opened the door himself. When he saw the detectives, his face turned gray. "Hank Harrison, you're under arrest on suspicion of the murder of Daniel Coleman." Sarah read him his rights as she handcuffed him. Gwen and the children watched from the doorway, shocked and confused. Cameras clicked incessantly, capturing every moment of the political star's downfall. "I want a lawyer," were the only words Harrison uttered. A long night began at the police station. Harrison's lawyer, an expensive criminal lawyer from Los Angeles, arrived 2 hours later. David Rodriguez was known for his ability to defend high-profile clients. "My client denies all charges," Rodriguez declared. "You only have circumstantial evidence." But the evidence was compelling. Financial transfers, photographic surveillance, witness testimony, physical traces in the car, a compromised alibi, and most importantly, motive. "Your client had a gay relationship with the victim," Sarah said during the interrogation. "The victim was blackmailing him. It's a classic motive for murder." Harrison sat silently, staring at the table. His political career was finished regardless of the outcome of the trial. The scandal had already become public thanks to leaked photos. At 3 a.m, Rodriguez asked for a private meeting with his client. An hour later, he returned. "My client is willing to testify in exchange for a plea deal." The confession came slowly, painfully. Harrison told the whole story. The affair, the blackmail, the desperate attempt to save his career and his family. The meeting in the park was supposed to be the last one, the final payment for his silence. "But when he demanded more money, regular payments, I realized it would never end," Harrison said, staring at the floor. "He would have destroyed my life piece by piece." "So you killed him?" "It was impulsive. I had a gun in my car. When he said he would never leave me alone, that he could always come back for more money, I just snapped." A plea agreement was reached 2 weeks later. Harrison pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter in exchange for 15 years in prison. His political career was over, his marriage destroyed, his children refused to speak to him. Gwen filed for divorce immediately after his arrest. "I didn't know the man I married," she told reporters. She continued working at the children's hospital but moved to another city to escape the publicity. The mayoral election was postponed, then won by Harrison's opponent. The city council distanced itself from the scandal, claiming they knew nothing about their former colleague's private life. Marcus Thompson wrote a series of articles about political corruption and the hidden lives of public figures. His investigation won a state journalism award, but he often thought about the price of success, the life of a young man who had become a victim of power and fear. Sarah Mitchell closed the case, but the memory of it remained. It was a reminder of how secrecy and shame can drive people to desperate acts. In a big city, everything was interconnected: power, money, fear, love. And sometimes those connections led to tragedy. 3 months later, Sarah received a letter from Harrison in prison. He asked for forgiveness and talked about the therapy he was undergoing. "I killed the man I loved out of fear of the truth," he wrote. "It will haunt me for the rest of my life." Daniel Coleman was buried in a small cemetery in Ohio, where his parents had grown up. His photographs were eventually exhibited in a gallery in San Francisco, a posthumous exhibition of a talented young artist whose life had been cut short. In Irvine, life went on. Bars were filled with new bartenders, politicians made new promises, and Mason Park once again became a peaceful place for family picnics. But those who knew the story remembered the lesson about dangerous secrets and the price people are willing to pay to keep them.